Our next panel is going to be led by Matthew Shmigelsky, and he is with CLEER, and he's also with the Colorado Clean Energy Office. And he and his colleagues are going to talk to us about transportation transition.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, panelists, for attending today and joining this conversation on the transportation transition. I want to just kind of lay out a little bit of the structure of the next 35 minutes for everyone. We'll do a quick introduction and bios of everybody, talk a little bit about why transportation is so important to discuss in the conversation today, and then we'll break out kind of the conversation in three distinct areas. So a global perspective, why our transportation, why is that so important to discuss? We'll talk about it from a technology perspective, what's available today, and how that technology will address some of these issues. And then we'll talk from a local perspective, and then we'll wrap it up with some questions. So jumping in, again, welcome. Thank you for joining today. And let's talk about folks that we have on the panel today. So starting all the way on the left-hand side there is Ryan Popple, CEO of Proterra. And Proterra is the leading electric bus manufacturer in the U.S. And before joining Proterra, Popple was instrumental in the successful capitalization of Tesla Motors. And as the senior director of finance, the company scaled from pre-revenue to $100 million in vehicle revenue. Prior to that, was a partner at Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Byers at the Green Growth Fund, focused on late-stage venture clean tech investments, and also serves on the EV Strategic Council. So welcome, Ryan. Thanks. We have Mona Newton, who is the executive director of the Community Office for Resource Efficiency here in the Roaring Fork Valley. And she works and has worked in the public and private sectors promoting energy efficiency and renewable energy for 20 years, and has developed numerous programs, including the country's first carbon tax. Thank you, Mona. And then we have Robert Hutchinson from the Rocky Mountain Institute. He's a senior fellow at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and also is an investor advisor, board member for startups in energy and environmental and the impact spaces, consultant on low carbon technologies and finance, and a writer and speaker on energy. Thank you, Hutch, for joining. And then we have Harry Kloor, who's a filmmaker, scientist, educator, inventor, entrepreneur. And he's going to discuss from the perspective of a company, Zero Power and Zero Power Solutions, focused on commercializing a suite of green technologies for use in the heavy truck transportation and stationary power generation markets. Additionally, he operates a few companies, so it looks like CEO and founder of Jupiter 9 and Productions and Lures and company, as well as a lead in the XPRIZE Foundation. So thank you all for joining. And just to talk a little bit about why transportation is so important, I think a lot of times in the clean energy discussion, transportation is left out in many cases. I think it's one of the more challenging conversations to address. It's disparate and requires some big ideas. So I'm excited to hear how we can address the topic and look at technology for solutions. Additionally, transportation's emissions edged electricity out in terms for the first time in 2016. So the issue is becoming more apparent or needs to be addressed. Just to give that some perspective, electricity emissions have been reduced 20% since 2005, whereas transportation emissions had a drop following the recessions and have been steadily increasing since 2010. So with that, I'll hand it over to Hutch to give us a global perspective on transportation and emissions.
I always love hard questions, and this is a particular hard one. So I think what I'm going to try to do is just give you guys a couple of frameworks and also perspective. First, I think it's totally untrue that the clean tech world is dominated by what's going on in electricity. There's a ton of innovation moving in various ways in various places. But let me try to frame a couple of ways to think about it. First, transportation is all about mobility of things and of people, and you actually want to think about those two differently. So there's a freight and stuff world, and there's a people world. There's also very much an urban world and a rural world. And as you might expect, as we go through our information revolution and economic revolutions, the urban people world is already starting to move quite quickly in very interesting ways. And the fundamental thing that's starting to happen is that people are starting to think about what happens if mobility is no longer a car-dependent or thing-dependent concept, but it's actually a service that gets supplied to us in intelligently coordinated, IT organized ways. So mobility as a service. And then you look at that and say, oh, well, why would we do that? We got convenience of the cars. Because like so many other things in this new economy, there's just horrendous waste associated with the use of that much ironmongery and that much concrete on highways and that much parking space in highly expensive locations where they're near people work or live. So there's just unbelievable amounts of waste associated with that much in the way of assets associated with moving us around. And so what it takes is more intelligence and more information to get a different system in place. And it turns out that mobility as service works super well if your vehicles on the small end of the scale, as you work on that end, are electrified, if they're autonomous, and if they're shared. And it turns out, and there's a number of groups doing the math, that RMI were one of the groups that do this, it turns out that most of the vehicles that go into cities and then park in cities all day and then move around in cities or out of them are just simply unneeded, as is the space for them, the parking and the highways. And if you add up all that math about where there might be new sources of value in that, new sources of personal time in that, less congestion in that, frankly, I think it's the hugest opportunity on the planet for human beings to have better lives, better air, more good stuff, less waste. So there's a huge thing going on there. There's also many forces arrayed against it, which we'll have to fight. You know, obviously the fossil fuel industry is not so keen on having a demand-driven peak and decline happening. However, more and more of the prognosticators that are independent of that particular industry are starting to say, look, we are starting to look at demand peak scenarios in terms of fossil oil use, and fossil fuel use is on the oil side totally dominated by transportation. So there's this mobility as a service thing going on. And you think about, will it apply to the developing world? Absolutely, except there it might actually apply faster because the economics of people's time is a little different. You don't need the autonomous to make the economics so dominant that it'll drive. You can do it with a driver still, and you can also do it with things that are less expensive and less luxurious than cars. You can do it with two-wheelers and three-wheelers. We've been in a series of meetings with the government of India on trying to drive exactly this for Indian cities, because Indian cities can't build big highways. Never going to happen. The property rights, the ownership structures, the decision-making dynamics. So they're just going to grind to a halt if they get too many more personally owned cars in the place. So all that is going on. So that's, I think, the fast change bit. In the other quadrants, the people rural side of things, high-speed trains are going to help a little bit in places where you're moving between dense and dense. But other than that, we don't see that changing a ton. And frankly, that's a tiny bit of the equation. In most countries, trains are way better than anything else. So trains, if you can do them. But even airplanes can become much more efficient. They have already become much more efficient than they were. People my age remember 707s and the immense amount of noise. That noise is an indicator of waste. On the freight side, freight's also tremendously interesting. Freight in many countries of the world is the dominant use of fuel in places like China. Freight and trucks are far more energy use and oil use than people moving around is. And freight systems in much of the world are horrifically inefficient just in terms of logistics planning and management, use of better quality information. So that's a piece of the puzzle. Big heavy trucks are the sort that we use here. Used to have a fleet average of about 6 miles a gallon. It's already getting up to 8 just on the basis of simple add-on technologies. In some small parts of the fleet, it can get to 9 or 10 with those adders and some training of the drivers, and it can get to 12 if we can certainly physically do another generation of heavy trucks and maybe make them a little longer, have a uniform standard so they don't have to be the least efficient size. So that is a little bit of the story. That's freight rural. Freight in cities, have you seen, with the rise of Amazon and everybody ordering on the internet, freight is now going everywhere. We are seeing some need for some new invention about how you do small freight in cities. Literally, you could fill a truck for every block in New York several times a day, delivering boxes around, and then you have all the reverse logistics of all the cardboard. We see some rationalization coming out of that because that's leading in sort of scarce resource expensive cities like New York and San Francisco. Something's going to give, and people are going to invent sort of better ways of getting that stuff in. I'm not sure if it's flying or not. Let me wrap up then on the big picture side. You now have my framework: urban, rural, people, freight. But if you look across the technologies, there is a ton of cool stuff going on across every technology you can think of. Mass transit can and will get better with information, et cetera. But the big issue about mass transit is having enough of it in the right places. If you have good mass transit, it tends to fill up, and then your mass transit is not working anymore because it's not mass enough. But there's up to about 10 gigatons of potential in mass transit. Just staying at the current level of usage of mass transit and not having that leakage out because we don't have enough capacity, much less growing it. High-speed rail, several gigatons. Ships are grossly inefficient right now. There's 8 to 10 gigatons there. EVs, we all know there's huge opportunities there. Some smaller things like ride sharing and e-bikes. Airplanes, you probably think about that being a problem, but there's 5 to 8 gigatons there in doing things we already know how to do, about the same in trucks, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hopeful about the world of transportation.
Great. Thanks, Hutch, for touching on some of the key topics. The rural and urban divide is a big one to consider. And kicking off in the technology piece. I think that's what we have a depth of knowledge for sure here. So I'll hand it over to Ryan to share the electric bus and electric drive world and where that stands currently and what you see moving forward.
Sure. So I've got really good news about mass transit and electrification and decarbonization. So I hope I can provide a little bit of optimism and motivation that there's actually a lot going on that we don't necessarily see depending on where we are in the country or in the world. But we're incredibly excited about what's happening with EV and mass transit. Just to back up one step in terms of thinking about the criticality of transportation and energy, I got into clean energy, and partly motivated after serving in the U.S. Army and spending some time in the Middle East. So I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, spent about 4 years in the active duty Army, and got to visit some of the more unstable regions of the world, which happened to really control the spare capacity on oil. And we're all sitting here right now, and we're totally comfortable with a situation that's incredibly risky. And that situation is you need 80 to 100 million barrels of oil per day. So just think about that for a second. Stop looking at your phone. 80 to 100 million barrels of anything. And if you cut it off for one day, we can't move, we can't grow crops, we can't build things in factories, we can't generate power on a lot of our islands. Like, it's over in 60 days. So, when you read about various Middle Eastern nations blockading other nations and rising tensions, and where Iran and Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Russia and US and Russian fighter planes getting uncomfortably close in Syrian airspace, that's our energy paradigm. So we sit here and we're quite comfortable with the fact that when we go to the gas station, there will be 80 to 100 million barrels of oil per day that are going to enable that. And everything stops. And if you need an example of how everything stopped, summer of 2008. Oil hit about $140 a barrel, and the ripple effects, FedEx business didn't work. The airlines business didn't work. The car companies' businesses didn't work because the US automakers foolishly have invested their margin points into SUVs and pickup trucks. And the residual value, the lease value of all those heavy vehicles was worthless when oil hit $150 a barrel. So we're fortunate that we haven't seen oil embargoes like we saw twice in the 70s. We're fortunate that there hasn't been a shooting war that breaks out somewhere that cuts off the flow of oil. But I worry more about oil than I worry about any other form of energy. And it's because it is one of the most perfect monopolies in the world. You turn off the oil, everything stops. So you're literally bent over a barrel. I'll share a framework with you that I think is very helpful in thinking about transportation and explaining why mass transit's going, taxis are going, delivery trucks are going. So if you have a pen and paper, you just draw a 2x2 matrix, and on one axis you have vehicle miles traveled, VMT, that's your annual mileage, and on the other axis you have gallons per mile, which is the inverse of miles per gallon. And just plot vehicle categories there. So take the city bus, 40,000 miles VMT per year, and only 4 miles to the gallon. So the inverse, it uses a quarter of gallon of diesel fuel per mile. So the buses I saw last night rolling around Aspen, which is great transit service, but those buses are burning 0.25 gallons of fuel, of diesel, for every mile they go. So what that means is anything you plot in the upper right corner of that matrix has the highest fuel demand per year, the highest willingness to pay for EVs. So that's why we as a company started with mass transit vehicles. We think it's going to be mass transit, school bus, delivery truck, heavy port trucks, and those sectors are going to result in gigatons of carbon reduction, and they're going to end the monopoly on fossil fuels. I'll wrap up just by explaining kind of what we're up to. I often get the question, well, so Proterra, when are you going to build your first vehicle? It's already off to the races. We have vehicles performing revenue service, beating diesel buses, beating hybrids, beating natural gas in 18 cities in the US already, and our backlog is approaching $500 million of orders for buses. And the secret to it was getting to product market fit, building a bus that we could sell for about the price of a hybrid that gets 4 to 5x the energy efficiency, that's silent, that offers riders a better experience, that saves operators money. But these buses are in Texas, they're in Washington State, they're in California. This Friday, I'll be launching a fleet in Park City, Utah. So very similar community to Aspen. We're also in Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, South Carolina, Massachusetts. We're shipping to Duluth. We get an inbound international request for our vehicles almost every week, and we tell all of them no. And the reason we tell them no is we're too busy shipping vehicles to Everett, Washington, or to Missoula, Montana. So as a company, we are very patriotically focused on eliminating fossil fuel dependency of urban transit fleets. So the last thing I'll say, just wrapping up my comments, is if you live near a transit fleet, if you see a bus in your daily life, that's your transit bus. Your tax dollars paid for at least 50% of it. So figure out who's on the board of your transit agency. Go have coffee with them and just ask them, What are we doing about electrification? Because Los Angeles just announced that they will be 100% electric by 2030. Seattle, 100% electric by 2034. Foothill Transit, which is the San Gabriel Valley, 100% electric by 2030. And it just goes on and on and on. So you can think global, act local, and it's your transit fleet. I live in Half Moon Bay, California. I want Route 17 and Route 294 cleaned up because I don't want any diesel pollution in my community.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Here we go. More buses.
Great. Continuing on the technology side of the equation, I'm hand it over to Harry to talk a little bit about the perspective from Zero and what they have in terms of technology to.
Thank you. So I'm here in place of Ken, who's the CEO of Zero. I'm both an investor in Zero, and then last year I agreed to come on as their Chief Science Officer. Zero has 3 areas of technology. One is for injectors, which impacts on this talk. Another one is a way in which they're cleaning up flare gas. And a third is in graphene. Graphene will potentially impact massively in the electrical arena in terms of being able to make much better batteries for electrical vehicles and whatnot. The Zero flare technology may also have impact because it basically converts all flare gas into pure pipeable quality methane, and it eliminates all the diesel. So it has a double savings. They reduce the pollution from flare gas, which is enormous, much bigger than you can imagine, because once you actually start exploring and you find many of these countries are polluting many multiples above what people think they're doing. And so they get a savings on the flare, and you get a savings on the diesel, because you don't have to run a diesel generator. You can actually take what is considered pollution and run the well to get the oil. Their approach, by the way, is towards the future of electric and hydrogen, but an intermediate step of not denying the fact that there's 80 to 100 million barrels of oil a day. If you're just going to deny the use of oil and focus only on electric and solar and geothermal and not seek to clean up the industry while you're heading towards these renewable fuels, you're missing the big opportunity. And finally, their injector technology, which impacts a lot what you were saying with regards to the fact that freight is one of the biggest consumers of energy and probably the most polluting, because much of freight is moved using diesel. There aren't a lot of big electric or methane vehicles running around moving freight. In fact, the injector technology created with over $150 million in investment from Zero was to create an injector that would allow you to have a methane vehicle have the same power and torque as diesel. And so while we have methane trucks and cars, we don't have big, large trucks, semi-tractor trailers and whatnot using methane because of the power and torque issue. So if you're trying to get over a mountain and you can't get over the mountain, you're not going to deploy this. Now the good thing is they actually cracked that problem. They broke through what many people thought was impossible by combining their technology with Woodward. So Woodward makes most of the injectors in the world and a lot of other control systems and engines. And they have a deal that actually the paperwork is about that big. And so as an OEM, they're, I think, about 2 to 3 years into the execution of being able to roll out these injectors globally for large vehicles and also for anything from a tugboat, trains, et cetera, using this injector technology. And again, while it's not electric, there's a big difference between the footprint of using natural gas, methane, versus using diesel. The injectors also have the capability of running on hydrogen. So again, here the transition is replace the diesel with methane, but then as we move forward and hopefully have better hydrogen technology for both storage and use, then you could also then just shift to that. So then, of course, your pollutant is water. Zero is, I think, providing one solution to the freight issue that you spoke to.
Great. Thanks, Harry. let's move out of technology and talk about local perspectives. So what's possible, what's been achieved here in our region, in our local valley in terms of transportation improvements and engagement on the consumer side.
Thanks,
Simone?
Matt, and I appreciate being on the panel. I've got a few slides. Can we cue those? Great, so if we could just go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about how CLEER, the Community Office for Resource Efficiency, helps to inspire, lead, and engage our citizens in getting involved in changing their behavior. I really enjoyed the talk earlier about we have to take action. And so that's what we're really promoting is how we can make real change. We have a new engagement program we're calling the High Five. And maybe some of you were here yesterday and went to the energy confessional and confessed your sins. But we're really trying to work on an engagement piece. And you were able to share that. Oh, thank you. Great. So let's. So here's what how we're trying to engage people. We're really trying to use fun as a way to engage people and make it fun because all of us that are here in the room, we know this is not easy work that we're trying to do. I mean, if you're trying to get money, you're trying to develop technology, and we're trying to change people's habits. So this is our June action of the month. It's called Freewheeling, Fresh Air Seeking Energy Rock Stars Wanted. And so we want you to sign up for the High Five. We want you to start changing your habits, and we want to engage you as part of this. And we're working in the Roaring Fork Valley for those of you who are not familiar with CLEER. And the Roaring Fork Valley is Aspen to Glenwood Springs. So here we have one of the programs that we've helped support is Recycle. You mentioned the bicycles. It's very active. The Roaring Fork Valley is an interesting area because it acts very much rural, but it also has a lot of urban characteristics. People want to get out of their cars. People want to take mass transit. And so within the Aspen area, we have WeCycle. And actually, WeCycle has expanded all the way down to Basalt. So you can find these bikes in various places in all of our communities. And because their stations are mobile, they're PV powered. It's a little bit hard to see the PV the PV panel up there, but they try to eliminate their electricity use. So not only are they greening your transportation, they're greening the way that they track how they're taking their fees and whatnot. So this is a couple of our employees out at the RMI Innovation Center. We were there last week to listen to a talk from a guy from Cuba. And they're greening their transportation because they took the bus from Carbondale and they grabbed the WeCycles, and that was a great way to get there. We've talked about the transition to EVs. One of the challenges, as we all know, is charging stations. And so within the Roaring Fork Valley, and Matt has been really instrumental in leading that issue of helping us develop the EV charging station infrastructure. And you get all kinds of opinions from Tesla to various folks about where charging stations are going. But for right now, we know we need them in good locations so there can be plenty of access to them. And so we have the EV charging stations, and they're pretty abundant between Aspen and Glenwood Springs. And for now, most of them are free. I think the city of Aspen, ironically, is the only one charging for the EV charging in the garage, in the parking garage. But there's fast chargers in plenty of locations, and we've got a good sense of where they are around the valley. So if you have an electric vehicle, I think we could add a few more in Snowmass, but they're pretty prevalent, and that's really important. And that's important because right now we're coordinating with a number of different organizations, including CLEER, where Matt works, and the City of Aspen, and Holy Cross Energy to promote an EV sales event right now. So those people who live in the Roaring Fork Valley have an opportunity to buy a lower cost electric vehicle because the dealers have been willing to drop the price a little bit. I know that was really successful in the Boulder, Denver area. And again, we're rural, urban combination, but we want to do the same thing. We know that it's important we see a lot of traffic up and down the valley, and if you get stuck in that traffic going into Aspen in the morning, it would be much nicer if those were electric vehicles as opposed to gas-powered vehicles. There'd be a lot fewer emissions. So we're promoting that. That's going to be ending at the end of June. And we set a goal, and we're moving towards that goal to try to get people to buy those vehicles in the valley. And that's something that's really important. We also have an EV plan that the city of Aspen has put together. And the city has taken charge, and I don't have some photos, but if you're staying in Aspen or you spend any time here, there's a free shuttle that you can pick up, and it will take you around town within the downtown area. So if you're not bicycle friendly, or if you have a dog, or you're not, you just aren't that mobile, you can take this free vehicle, and it's electric powered. So that's another area we're really just trying to try everything that people might be interested in trying and taking to increase their mobility and to reduce the car traffic, because it's not only the emissions, but it's the traffic itself that is quite a problem in the Roaring Fork Valley. So we also have a program called Car2Go, which is available again in many cities, but in our rural area, and that's one of our employees, and we actually use the Car2Go. Most of them are hybrids. This truck is not, but that's how we were able to get the Energy Confessional up here to the Viceroy, by using Car2Go, and it makes it so, somebody was talking about how vehicles are not used. This is a really good system. They have 9 vehicles in the Car2Go program here in Aspen, and you can take it, up and down the valley. You can go almost to Moab. You can go almost to the Front Range with them, and it's a very economical way of using an automobile if you don't own one. And then lastly, well, maybe not lastly, but we have a very incredible rural transit system. The RAFTA, it's the Roaring Fork Transit Authority, and most of the communities throughout the valley belong to it and support it financially, and it's a separate entity. And we've gone from, this is one of the first rural BRTs in the country, and it's been incredibly successful. We have the X Games, and we have all kinds of activities and events around here, and RAFTA does a great job of deploying additional buses when they need to, and they have a number of CNG vehicles. And about a month and a half ago, we had a workshop here in Aspen, and it was one of those workshops where you thought it was going to be talking and no action. They moved to action very quickly, and they have decided they're going to apply for a grant. They're going to raise money so we can order 3 Proterra buses within the next, I think it's 2018, 2019 timeframe. So
Fingers crossed that they get the grant.
yeah, fingers crossed that they get the grant, and we'll be able to place our order, and you'll be able to say yes. So, but there's a real commitment to not only to increase the mass transit, as somebody mentioned, we have to increase the mass because it is at capacity in some times of the year, but we also have to green that transportation as well. And that's something that people are very interested in, because they do complain about the diesel emissions and the noise in communities, especially when they're going through Aspen. And we talk about we're reaching that capacity of buses in Aspen, and so we have to figure out, how do we get people out of the vehicles? How do we make those buses cleaner, quieter, and more mobile? So there's a number of things that we're trying here in the Valley. So I think that's all I have at this point. And that's my contact information and our website, if any of you care to take a look. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Mona. So I think we're kind of winding down on time. I think maybe you're a little bit more than is on the clock, actually, because we're a little bit in flux on how much time allocated. But wanted to maybe pose a few questions, and then I want to keep some time for questions from the audience for sure. So first and foremost, I want to ask, obviously, capital investments a requirement. You got a transit bus that has a significant cost. What's the avenue there? I know federal dollars are in flux. Where do you see the opportunity, Ryan, and specifically posed to you in terms of what the structure might be for?
Yeah, I think electric bus technology, and it's a good microcosm to what starts happening when a clean energy technology starts reaching economic parity, and not just on total cost of ownership, but on acquisition cost as well. You start exiting the sort of incentive market and entering the mass market, and these markets are so large. Anything you're doing in transportation or energy in general is so big that once you start approaching parity with a fossil fuel dominant technology, a very, very large market widens out. So 5 years ago, 7 years ago, electric buses were about the same price as fuel cell buses. So these were $1 million R&D buses. What has happened, the cost of lithium-ion batteries, the cost of carbon fiber, power electronics, electric motors, even charging stations that are now standardized across a single plug-in form factor, it's all just gotten cheaper at a pretty tremendous rate. So batteries, were $1,000 a kilowatt hour 7 years ago. Companies today are building automotive-grade battery packs for less than $300 a kilowatt hour today. So a 70% cost reduction. So, we are finding no shortage of cities that are able to pull together various resources to deploy these vehicles. One of the good things that's going on is the FTA is still operating under the FAST Act, which was a 5-year appropriations bill. That act, or that funding is active through 2020. It'll need to be renewed again. It was one of the few things that actually got through a very divided Congress. So it's a fairly bipartisan issue in that we need roads, bridges, sidewalks, transit buses, trains, and it's billions of dollars of funding a year. But it does take a lot of creativity, especially when you're doing your first deployment. First deployment is harder because you have training costs, you have infrastructure for the first time. The transit community went through it on the CNG side, so they know how to do it. But once we get the ball rolling, the beautiful thing about it is the electric vehicles provide enough savings that they start funding future electric vehicles. So if you can get over that hump, if you can get the initiation energy going, we have not had a single customer go back the other direction. Once they start deploying electric, they keep deploying electric, and a lot of them tear up old contracts that had them locked in to buy diesel buses. So they can really get a virtuous cycle going.
Great. And then jumping into more on the light duty side of the world, big portion of emissions is that fleet, the light duty fleet, which is much more disparate, much more decentralized. How do we address that? And does the conversion of individual electric vehicle or adoption of electric vehicles actually solve the climate problem? I'll kick that off.
Shall I kick that off? Whether or not we keep CAFE standards here obviously depends on the process that's ongoing. But the good news is the biggest players in the car business are global and have to be global to be economic. Europe's standard is slightly ahead of and slightly tougher than our US CAFE standard. The Chinese standard is just about the same as the European one, slightly faster but the same level. So if you're going to compete in those big three markets, you have to make lots more efficient cars, or to be able to make lots more efficient cars. So the ability to make more efficient cars and have more electrification and have all grades of hybridization, which is really a wonderful thing. Hybrid is good in cars. You don't have to go pure electric if your driving cycle isn't appropriate. So the ability to make them will be there, and there will be lots of product available somewhere in the world. Whether it is imported here and bought here depends on the consumer, because we may not have as much structure from governments, et cetera, saying things about it. We will still have air pollution requirements because they're not going to be able to change those laws fundamentally. That will drive some things. Ozone rules will drive some things. California will drive some things. So you'll have that as well. So I'm hopeful that the fleet will continue to evolve, with the one variable being us. What do we buy? Do we buy great big things that we drive around by ourselves, or do we drive smaller things that we share, or do we not buy at all and we just share? That's our deal. And that's actually the variable. The rest of the stuff will happen. It's not a bunch of uncertainty about whether it'll happen. It's in economics, it's in technology, it's in all that stuff. So the uncertainty is us.
Okay. Great. I think we're running pretty low on time, but I want to definitely get a few questions from the audience to kind of tap the knowledge that we have on stage here. So is there anyone that has? Go ahead, in the back.
Chip.
I want to thank everybody for bringing this really important conversation of transportation to the AREDAY. Globally, I think there's about 1 billion cars, trucks, and buses. It's probably a little higher than that now. And they emit probably just guessing, 40% of the world's carbon throughput. So the great transition that we talk about from combustion motors to electric motors and all of the other transitions that are happening throughout the entire spectrum represented locally. I love Mona's presentation because, you know, everything is local, no matter how global we want to get. It's all local somewhere. I wanted to just ask Ryan what your hopes are in terms of the bus fleet in the United States in terms of the transition to an electric fleet, you know, the various markets that you're working in. And I also want to mention, following up on Mona's remarks, that we are actually also very much interested in helping to advance this group sales. And so we have something called AREDAY Electric that happens up on the hill here Thursday and Friday, where you can test drive a Tesla, a Bolt, a Volt, a Nissan Leaf, and whatever else we can manage to get, maybe some electric bicycles, and maybe get a discount on them. So really trying to, I drive a Volt. I think it's a fantastic vehicle. Want to get a Tesla when I can afford it. But Ryan, could you?
Yeah,
thanks.
so I think the pace of change on heavy-duty electric is taking a lot of people by surprise. I think we all previously assumed that electric vehicles depended upon a very lightweight vehicle. The reality is electric motors are the best generators of torque that have ever been invented. So if you need to move an aircraft carrier, you use an electric screw. Same with a submarine, and even a big locomotive is a series of diesel generators generating electricity to turn an electric motor. So electric motors are great at moving heavy things, and buses are really heavy. You know, I think it's going to happen faster than people expect. We have been caught off guard consistently in the past 2 years in terms of our sales numbers. That never happens in a technology startup. I've worked with a lot of them. And so I've accused my head of sales of sandbagging, and the numbers keep coming in higher. These industrial markets, they have a fast follower implication. So when we started out, it was 1 agency in Southern California. Then it was 6 agencies. Then it was 20 agencies. And the last time I checked, we're in conversations with 61 US cities that are actively trying to procure. So, you know, I'll make a wild forecast. Electric bus will be cheaper than a diesel hybrid bus by 2019. Diesel hybrid buses are about 20% of the market. The diesel hybrid bus market will be gone. And the reason is an electric bus has the same range now as a diesel hybrid bus, but you get 20 miles the gallon and no emissions, lower maintenance costs versus 5 miles the gallon. So I think EV eats diesel hybrid buses by 2019. I think it eats natural gas. Whether it's biomethane or fracked methane, it doesn't matter. A natural gas bus only gets about 3 miles the gallon, and they're loud. So EV is going to take out natural gas probably by 2021. And I'd say in 2025, I doubt any agency in the US buys a municipal transit bus that runs on fossil fuels. California is contemplating having the whole fleet, and California is the largest transit market in North America, and it's the 6th largest economy in the world. California wants their entire bus fleet turned over to zero emission by 2040. And what that does, it's the lighthouse, it's the signaling effect. Cummins, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of diesel engines, has announced that they're going to start working on electric motors because they know they will not be selling diesel engines to city buses and school buses 10 years from now. So it's going to happen fast, but you know, as you said, everything's local. I love the fact that Park City, after demoing an electric bus, Park City City Council asked the transit fleet, why would we buy another diesel bus at this point? It may take us 10 years to transition, but let's stop digging the hole deeper. So it's happening fast, and a lot of it's driven by the fact that the riders really like the electric buses. They're just a little bit nicer than the traditional transit experience, and we need more people out of cars. There's this really great synergy between autonomous small vehicles, Uber, Lyft, and mass transit. So let's clean up mass transit.
Okay. I guess in the signal we can't accept any questions. So really thought-provoking ideas and discussions. So very much appreciated from each and every one of the panelists. And I'm sure folks will be around to continue the dialogue in the room. So look forward to that. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you.